I've got a batch of oyster mushrooms coming out the side of a 5-gallon bucket right now. Pale gray clusters shouldering their way out through drilled holes like they're trying to escape the thing 3 weeks after I set this whole thing up. If you watched my video on growing shiitake on logs, you know that method takes something like 6 months to a year before you see your first mushroom. This one took 3 weeks. Same basic idea, wood turning into food, but a completely different tool for a completely different situation. Let's get into it. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because I get into this kind of practical, tested homestead knowledge pretty regularly. I want to be upfront about why I'm showing you a second method, instead of just telling you to go do the log thing I already covered. Logs are great if you've got standing hardwood you're willing to cut specifically for this, a shady spot to let them sit for a year, and the patience to wait most of a year before you see a single mushroom, which is a genuinely fine trade for a lot of people and a genuinely poor fit for a lot of others. Not everybody has all three of those things. What a lot of you do have, especially if you're running a sawmill or doing any amount of woodworking like I am, is scrap, chips, sawdust, the offcuts and byproduct that pile up whether you're using them for anything or not. Oyster mushrooms will turn a bucket of that scrap into real food in about a month. And that's a different enough proposition from the log method, both in timeline and in the raw material it asks of you, that I think it deserves its own full explanation instead of just a footnote on the other video. Oyster mushrooms are the right species for this because they're what growers call aggressive colonizers. They're not picky, they grow fast, and they can outcompete a lot of the molds and bacteria that would otherwise take over a substrate before the mushroom mycelium gets established. That aggressiveness is exactly what makes the bucket method work at all, because unlike the log method, where you're inoculating essentially sterile solid heartwood that doesn't have much competition to worry about, a bucket of loose wood chips or sawdust is a wide-open buffet for anything airborne that wants to move in. Oysters are tough enough and fast enough to win that race most of the time, provided you give them a decent head start, which is where pasteurization comes in. Shiitake, by comparison, is a much fussier, slower colonizer, which is part of why the log method leans on drilling deep into solid, largely sterile wood instead of a loose substrate, giving the slower fungus a protected environment instead of throwing it into open competition. It would probably lose. Before we get to that, one honest caveat that would have saved me some wasted effort the first time I tried this. Most of what comes off my own mill is Douglas fir, and Douglas fir, like most softwoods, is a poor substrate for oyster mushrooms. Something about the resins and volatiles in softwood inhibits colonization badly enough that most growers just skip softwood entirely and stick to hardwood. That means my own sawdust, the stuff I've got the most of sitting around, isn't actually the right material for this particular project, which stung a little to admit on camera, given how much of it I've got piled up behind the shop at any given time. My first attempt at this used exactly that fir sawdust, mostly out of laziness, using what was already there instead of going and finding the right stuff. And it colonized so slowly and unevenly that the whole batch went moldy before the oyster mycelium ever got a real foothold. That failure is actually what sent me down the research rabbit hole that led to this whole video, so at least it wasn't a total waste. What does work is oak, maple, alder, and out here specifically, madrone, the same tree I've talked about before when we were out hunting morels. I don't mill much madrone, it's not exactly prized lumber, but I do end up with chunks of it from clearing and thinning work, and running some of that through the chipper gives me exactly the hardwood material this actually needs. Comment down below if you've got hardwood scraps sitting around from your own projects that you never had a real use for, because I think a lot of people are sitting on exactly the raw material for this without realizing it, whether that's from a mill, a firewood pile, or just yard cleanup. That's been going straight to the burn pile for years. Even something like clean cardboard or coffee grounds can work in a pinch for oysters. They're genuinely one of the least fussy species out there about what they'll colonize. But wood-based substrate tends to give a heftier, more substantial mushroom than either of those alternatives in my own experience, running a few side batches to compare side by side on the same shelf at the same time. Substrate choice matters beyond just hardwood versus softwood too. You can use fine sawdust, coarser wood chips, or a mix of both, and each has trade-offs worth knowing about. Fine sawdust colonizes faster because the mycelium has less material to work through to fully permeate the substrate, but it also holds less structure and can compact down, which limits airflow and can lead to soggy, anaerobic pockets if you're not careful with your moisture content. Wood chips take longer to fully colonize, sometimes noticeably longer, but they hold their shape better and tend to produce a heavier overall yield once they get going, since there's simply more solid material in there for the mycelium to eventually convert into mushrooms, rather than just fine particles that colonize quick but run out of substance just as quick. I run a mix, mostly chips with enough fine sawdust worked in to help the spawn get an early foothold, which seems to split the difference reasonably well between speed and eventual yield, giving me a faster start without sacrificing too much of that longer-term production the chips provide on their own. Pasteurization is the step that actually makes this whole thing work. And it's a different job than sterilization, even though people use the words interchangeably sometimes. Sterilization kills everything, every organism, every spore, which requires serious heat and pressure most home growers don't have equipment for. The kind of setup that starts looking more like a lab than a kitchen. Pasteurization is a lighter touch, just knocking back the population of competing organisms enough that the oyster mycelium can establish a strong enough foothold to outcompete whatever's left once you add spawn. Think of it less like sterilizing a surgical instrument and more like thinning a garden bed before you plant. You're not trying to kill every single weed seed in the soil forever. You're just giving your actual crop a fair head start against the competition. For wood chips and sawdust, the easiest home method is a hot water bath, heating the substrate to somewhere between 140 and 160 degrees and holding it there for about an hour. I do this in a big stock pot on the same propane burner I use for other outdoor cooking projects. Dunking the chips in a mesh bag so I can pull the whole batch out at once, instead of straining loose material out of hot water by hand, which is a genuinely miserable job I only made the mistake of doing without a bag one time. There's a cold alternative worth mentioning too, using hydrated lime instead of heat, soaking the substrate in water dosed with enough lime to push the pH up above 10 for 12 to 24 hours, weighing the substrate down so it stays fully submerged the whole time. The alkaline environment does roughly the same job the heat does, knocking back competing organisms enough to give the oyster spawn a fair shot, without needing to heat a large volume of water at all. I've tried both and settled on the hot water method mostly out of habit and because I've already got the burner and the pot sitting around for other projects. But the lime method is worth knowing about if you're working somewhere heating a big batch of water isn't practical, or if the idea of handling food-grade lime bothers you less than it does me. After the hot water bath, you need to drain and cool the substrate before it ever touches spawn, because spawn added to still warm material will just cook right along with everything you were trying to protect it from. I spread mine out on a clean tarp to cool and drip dry, checking it periodically with a simple squeeze test. You want it to feel like a well-wrung out sponge, damp enough to clump together when you squeeze it, but not so wet that water runs out freely. A distinction that took me a batch or two of trial and error to really internalize by feel instead of guesswork. Growers who like to be precise about this will actually weigh the dry substrate before pasteurizing, then weigh it again once it's rehydrated, aiming for roughly double the original dry weight as the sweet spot for moisture content. I don't always bother with the scale, but I did the first few times until I got a feel for what the right dampness actually looks and feels like by hand. And I genuinely recommend doing the same rather than skipping straight to eyeballing it the way I do now. Once the substrate's cooled and properly damp, it's time to build the buckets. Take a 5-gallon bucket, food grade if you can find one. Since you don't want whatever the original contents were leaching into something you're planning on eating, food service places sometimes give these away for free if you ask nicely. Worth checking a local restaurant or deli before buying new ones, and drill a pattern of half-inch holes around the sides, spaced out in a rough grid. These are your fruiting holes, the spots where mushrooms will eventually push their way out once colonization is complete. There's a balance to how many holes you drill that took me a batch or two to get a feel for. Too few, and the mushrooms don't have enough exit points to fruit well once they're ready. Too many, and you lose too much moisture out of the substrate during the weeks it needs to stay damp while colonizing. I've landed on somewhere around a dozen holes spread evenly around a standard bucket, which seems to strike a reasonable balance between the two. Layer your pasteurized substrate and sawdust spawn together as you fill the bucket. A couple inches of substrate, a handful of spawn, repeat, working your way up until the bucket's full, finishing with a layer of substrate on top so the spawn isn't just sitting exposed at the surface. There's no need to be precious about the exact ratio here. Oyster spawn is forgiving enough that a rough eyeball measurement works fine. Though more spawn generally means faster, more even colonization, if you can afford to be generous with it, rather than stretching a single bag as far as it'll go. Put a lid on it, loosely enough to allow a little air exchange, but snug enough to keep contamination and pests out, and set it somewhere dark, out of direct sun, at a reasonably stable room temperature. A closet or a corner of the shop works fine. Nowhere fancy required. For the next couple of weeks, that bucket just sits there looking like nothing's happening, which is the hardest part of this whole process for anybody who wants to see progress right away, myself included, the first time through, when I found myself checking the lid every single day, like that was somehow going to speed anything up, popping it open to peek, even though I knew full well nothing meaningful could have changed in the 24 hours since the last time I looked. Underneath the surface, the spawn is spreading through the substrate, and you'll start to see white mycelium creeping visibly through the holes and across the surface as it goes, first as faint wisps, then as a thick solid webbing that eventually looks almost like a light dusting of snow settled over everything, which is honestly a pretty satisfying thing to watch develop once you know what you're looking at instead of just seeing mold and panicking the first time. Once the substrate is fully colonized, solid white throughout instead of patchy, it's time to move the bucket somewhere with more light. Indirect is fine, more humidity, and a little fresh air exchange, which is what actually triggers fruiting. Mushrooms need to sense that conditions on the outside are worth the effort of pushing through before they'll bother forming, and a shift in light and humidity is one of the main signals that tells them it's go time, essentially convincing the fungus that conditions on the surface are finally good enough to risk sending something up into open air instead of continuing to spread quietly through the substrate where it's safe. I mist mine with a spray bottle once or twice a day once it's moved to the fruiting spot, just enough to keep the surface from drying out without soaking the whole bucket, which seems to be the detail that makes the biggest difference between a strong flush and a disappointing one. Within a few days of that shift, you'll start seeing tiny pins forming right at those drilled holes, little nubs that don't look like much yet but grow fast once they get started, doubling in size seemingly every time you check on them. From pin to full-sized, harvestable mushroom usually only takes another 3 to 5 days, which after weeks of watching nothing happen, feels almost absurdly quick, going from something you could easily mistake for a speck of dust to a full cluster you're cutting up for dinner in less than a week. Harvest by twisting and pulling the whole cluster gently rather than cutting, which gets more of the stem and leaves a cleaner spot for the next flush to form from instead of leaving stubs behind that can rot and invite contamination into an otherwise healthy bucket. And there will be a next flush. A well-built bucket will usually give you 2 or 3 good harvests, spaced a week or 2 apart, before the substrate's nutrients run down enough that production tapers off for good. I should also be straight about what can go wrong, because not every bucket turns out clean, and pretending this is foolproof would set you up for disappointment the first time it doesn't go smoothly. The most common failure is green mold, usually some species of trichoderma, showing up as a bright, almost neon green patch somewhere on the substrate instead of the white you're hoping to see spreading through it. Once that shows up in real force, there's not much to do but write that bucket off and start over, since trying to salvage it usually just means breathing in a lot of mold spores for a mushroom crop that was already lost anyway, not a trade worth making for the sake of stubbornness. In my experience, green mold shows up almost exclusively when the pasteurization step got skipped or rushed, or when the substrate was too wet going into the bucket, giving bacteria and competing fungi the advantage instead of the oyster spawn. It's discouraging the first time it happens, and it happened to me more than once early on, but it's also a pretty reliable signal pointing back at exactly which step in the process needs more attention next time, which makes it a useful failure even when it doesn't feel like one in the moment. Once you're actually eating what you grew, a quick note on preparation, since raw oyster mushrooms aren't something you want to eat straight off the bucket. Cook them through properly. A hot pan with a little oil is really all it takes, and they hold up beautifully in almost anything you'd normally use a mushroom for: soups, stir-fries, just sautéed on their own with a little garlic and butter until they're browned and tender. Unlike foraging wild mushrooms, where identification mistakes carry real consequences, sometimes serious ones, you know exactly what species you're eating here because you controlled every step of the process yourself, which is honestly one of the underrated advantages of growing your own, instead of relying entirely on what you can find and identify correctly out in the woods. That tapering off is where I want to be honest about the real trade-off between this method and the log method I already showed you, because I don't think it's fair to just sell you on the bucket method without mentioning what you're giving up to get that speed. A properly inoculated hardwood log can keep producing mushrooms for 3 to 5 years, flush after flush, season after season, long after you've forgotten exactly when you drilled it, sitting out in a shady corner of the property, quietly doing its job with essentially zero maintenance once it's established. A bucket gives you a handful of good flushes over a couple months, and then it's done, spent, ready to get dumped in the garden as compost, its whole productive lifespan compressed into a fraction of what a single log offers you. You're trading long-term production for speed and simplicity, and I don't think either side of that trade is objectively the right answer. It depends entirely on what you're actually trying to get out of the project. If you want a slow, steady, multi-year source of shiitake, and you don't mind waiting a year for the first harvest, logs are still the better long game. Set it and mostly forget it for years at a time without much more attention than an occasional glance to make sure nothing's disturbed it. If you want to actually eat mushrooms you grew yourself sometime in the next month instead of the next year, and you're fine repeating the process every few months to keep supply going, buckets are the better answer. More hands-on, but much faster to first payoff. I run both now. Logs going in the background for the long haul, buckets in rotation for anything I want sooner, which honestly feels like the smartest way to use two different tools instead of picking a permanent favorite between them, letting each one cover for what the other one is slow at. There's something satisfying about this whole process that goes beyond just the mushrooms themselves, and it's the same thing that got me interested in the log method in the first place. This is scrap, chips and offcuts that would otherwise get burned, dumped, or just left to rot in a pile behind the shop, material that costs nothing beyond the diesel to run the chipper and the time to gather it up. Running that material through a pasteurizer and a bucket and getting actual food back out the other end is about as close as I get to something for nothing out here using material I already had. That already cost me nothing beyond the time to gather and chip it, and turning it into a meal I'd otherwise have to buy at whatever the grocery store's charging for specialty mushrooms these days, which is not cheap. My grandfather would have appreciated that math, I think, even if buckets and hot water baths weren't exactly his style of doing things. He was never one to let material go to waste if there was a use for it sitting right there, scraps of lumber becoming kindling, bent nails getting straightened and reused instead of tossed. That whole generation's instinct for squeezing every bit of value out of what most people would call waste before finally letting it go. I don't think this would have struck him as any stranger than any of the other ways he found to squeeze value out of material most people would just throw away. He might have needed some convincing on the part where you deliberately grow fungus in a bucket in a dark closet, but I think he'd have come around once he tasted the results. If you're sitting on hardwood scrap of your own, from a mill, from firewood processing, from just clearing brush and small trees off your property, this is a genuinely accessible way to turn that pile into something you can actually eat, faster than almost any other food production method I've covered on this channel, and with equipment most people already have lying around somewhere. I'll put together a follow-up on spawn sourcing and where I actually buy mine, since that's the one piece of this whole process you can't really make yourself the way you can make everything else with stuff already lying around. Spawn's the one ingredient that has to come from somewhere with the actual expertise and equipment to produce it cleanly. For now, if you've got a pile of hardwood chips doing nothing useful behind your shop, you're closer to your next meal than you probably think. I'm Cole Ashford. Thank you for listening.